Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Welcome to FORPROLI YouTube channel. My name is Suellen Thomaz. I am an English language professor at Federal University of Southern Bahia, UFSB, on campus Sozígenes Costa in Porto Seguro, and general coordinator of the extension program Language Teachers Education FORPROLI. I'd like to welcome you on the meeting of the project Let's Talk About Emotions, Talks with Experts, which is a joint action developed by the Applied Linguistics Research Group, GPLA, at the Federal University of Viçosa, led by Professor Ana Maria Barcelos, by the Outreach Program on Language Teacher Education, the FORPROLI, led by Giva and me, at Federal University of Southern Bahia, and the Language Teaching Work Research Group at State University of Rio de Janeiro, led by Professor Gisele Colombo. So greetings to Professor Ana Maria Barcelos, Professor Paula, Professor Givanildo, to our volunteers here and our partners, Felipe Nunes, Melissa Teófilo, as well as our participants who are here on the YouTube channel with us. Thank you for coming. And now I invite all of you to the conversation circle titled The Ethical Imperative of Language Teacher Emotions for Development by Professor Paula Gollenbeck, and to introduce our speaker for this meeting and to mediate the conversation, I invite Professor Ana Maria Barcelos.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have Paula Gollenbeck here with us. Paula is clinical professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Florida, where she developed the undergraduate certificate in teaching English as a second language program. One of her primary responsibilities in the program is to mentor novice teachers in the practicum, the context in which she designs and researches Vygotskian social culture theory, grounded, praxis-based pedagogic interventions for language teacher professional development. Her research interests include language teacher narrative inquiry as professional development, teacher learning in second language teacher education, including the functional role of teacher emotions, and social cultural research and perspective on language teacher professional development. Paula is co-editor with Karen Johnson and Jacob Ricker, 2025, of Transformative L2 Teacher Education Innovations, Insights from Vygotskian Social Culture Theory by Routledge. She also co-authored and co-edited with Karen Johnson two books, Mindful L2 Teacher Education, A Social Cultural Perspective on Cultivating Teachers' Professional Development, and Research on Second Language Teacher Education, A Social Cultural Perspective on Professional Development, both by Routledge. She has a long-standing commitment to making teachers' voice public by serving on the scientific committee of the Columbia Journal Profile since 2011, editing the practitioner research section of language teaching research from 2018 to 2024, and co-editing Teachers' Narrative Inquiry as Professional Development by Cambridge. On a personal note, I'd like to say how fortunate and blessed I was to be able to work closely with Paula in 2019 on my sabbatical, and I could experience firsthand what a wonderful human being she is, and also to share her love for storytelling and narrative by going to several wonderful events on storytelling in Gainesville. I cherish those moments and that we work and hang out together. So Paula, it's an honor and a joy to have you here today. Thank you so much for being here with us. We are looking forward to listening to you. And to the audience, during Paula's talk, if you want to ask questions, you can send them via YouTube chat. To do so, please write the word question in capitals or pergunta in Portuguese. You can ask your questions in Portuguese or English before your question or your pergunta, so that we can identify it and pass it to Paula through after she talks, okay, at the end of her talk. So, and the attendance list will also be sent in the chat throughout the meeting, okay? So Paula, we give the floor to you, and thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Anna, Suellen, Jiva. It's really my honor and my pleasure, my joy to be here with you. I wish I were there physically, but I will have to appreciate the beauty of technology that brings us together. So thank you so much for the invitation. It really is an honor. I don't know if you remember this campus, Anna, but I just love the colors in this photo of this sky. It sort of speaks to my soul, and there's a kind of beauty but moodiness there. And I don't know, maybe my talk today's a little bit beauty and a little bit moody, so maybe it sets the tone for what I have to say today. So if you could switch to the next slide. So I want you to take a moment to look at this quote, because it kind of sums up what part of the impetus or the reason why I'm giving this talk today. And the question that I want to ask all of you is, when we look at emotions the way we have been, what's gained and what's lost? Because you cannot open a journal these days without finding at least one article talking about somebody's emotions. To me, emotions are everywhere. And anytime something becomes so popular, I think we have to kind of stop and take a look and say, what's going on? And so I think Jacob puts this very nicely. He talks about how much this burgeoning line of research of emotional experiences that novice teachers face. And we know that learning how to teach is a deeply emotional experience. And people have looked at it through emotional regulation, emotional intelligence. Emotional labor is something you see in a lot of journals. And a lot of this has been done through post-structuralist theories, especially about identity and emotion. And this research has been invaluable. Please don't get me wrong when I'm saying what I'm saying. I think this is important research. It has recognized who language teachers are, how they're positioned, what they experience in their settings. It highlights the ethical responsibility that teacher educators have, though, to create the conditions for language teachers to further examine that. In some sense, as I said, I think this is invaluable, but what is being ignored is the role that language teacher educators play in responding to novice teacher emotions. I think it's often under-theorized, sometimes overlooked, and in many cases, just simply ignored. We kind of put all the work on teachers to do the emotional, retelling of their lives. And the teacher educator has a role. The teacher educator matters in all this. If you could move to the next slide. These are my concerns as a language teacher, educator, researcher. And I put those words together. When I say language teacher, educator, inevitably for me, it means researcher too. I am always examining what I'm doing in terms of the activities I do, how I interact with my students, to have a sense of the impact of what I'm doing. Sometimes I write it up, sometimes I don't. Sometimes it's just for my personal consumption. But my concerns are we on emotion overkill? So are we just talking about emotions because that's the thing? That's the hot topic? Just because it hasn't been studied doesn't mean it needs to be studied. So for me, when I talk about emotions, it's part of the same coin as cognitive and emotional experiences. You can't talk about emotions without talking about being part of cognition. And part of the reason we know beginning teachers have such strong emotions is that sort of the cognitive, psychological, the content side of their understanding of language teaching hasn't really been developed enough. And so it's natural if you go in not being expert in something, you feel pretty emotional about having to then lead somebody as a teacher. So I want to say, just because we haven't studied the emotions of somebody somewhere in some context that's really unusual, it doesn't always mean that we need to study their emotions. For me, I come back to, what's my pedagogy? And as a language teacher, educator, researcher, I'm just going to say educator, I mean researcher. I have to ask myself, what is my pedagogy and where do emotions fit in? How do I understand emotions within what I do with my language teachers? I also feel that a lot of this research overemphasizes the past, the present, and it's not really future oriented. What we talk about is prolepsis. We're not thinking about the future self and development and self-regulation, but we can kind of get stuck in this kind of repeating the history of our emotions and explaining everything because of my emotions. I'm unhappy, and this is why. And I feel like that's not really, that's where the ethical responsibility comes in. I have to be able to move you beyond your emotions in order to function as a teacher, to become the teacher you aspire to be, to continue to develop as a teacher. And then finally, I think a lot of this research, it's done, these are my words, as subjective and systematic. And what I mean is, I follow data collection procedures and analysis procedures. I've read Sultana. I do Miles and Huberman. I follow those procedures. That makes me kind of, systematic in my approach. And hey, I wrote a position statement. So, I let my subjectivity become clear to you through my 2-paragraph position statement. And I feel like that really is, it still stays within the norms of very qualitative research frames that simply report findings. But then what else? Is that our role, to just simply report findings? So the question I want to ask is, as a language teacher, educator, researcher, how and why am I doing research? How and why matters a great deal. Okay, you can move on to the next slide. So I want to say emotions are central to language teacher development. I've been saying this for a long time. I see it as a source of development. I want to hear the emotions that my students, my beginning teachers, feel and express, because when I sense that cognitive emotional dissonance, that becomes a place that's telling me something. It's an index of something that they need my support for. And so it indexes for me what I need to mediate. And anytime there's that dissonance or contradiction, that is a space for development. We often think of contradiction as a bad thing, and I welcome it, because contradiction is really the space from which we can develop as teachers, as human beings, as doctors, as whatever, as anything in life. It's a kind of transformative space. So I want to say that as a language teacher educator, I have an ethical imperative to create the conditions to support my teachers' cognitive emotional development. And I want to do so through a praxis-based approach. And I'm going to say a lot more what I mean by that. But, basically speaking, it involves making very explicit what I'm doing, why, and I'm trying to take account of its impact. I want to have an understanding of what I do, how I work with my teachers, the impact it has on their development. And then once I work with this group of teachers, I want to continually revise through this cycle of theorizing, practical activity, and critical reflection. So as a teacher educator, I have these practices that I'm enacting and interacting with. but I'm also examining them. And then I'm also going back to my theory to understand why something worked, didn't work. And I'm going to look again for the next cycle of how not only I can continue to grow my teachers, but how I continue to grow myself. Okay, you can move ahead. So this is the roadmap of where we're going today. I want to talk a bit about this tripartite framework for language teacher educators that Karen Johnson and Jacob Breeker and I have been writing about, that I think is, we think of this as a psychological tool for language teacher educators. I would also say for language teachers, though we weren't talking about language teachers. And what I mean by it's a psychological tool is that you can use these three concepts to guide what you are doing with your teachers or your students. And so it's informing your thinking at various levels. And I'll talk through these different levels. It's helping you to think through, it's informing how you think and what you do. And then again, it creates a way for you to examine what you did as well. I'm going to talk about tiny talks, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. And I want to talk about my own emotional cognitive dissonance that really from which this emerged, because this really came out of my own emotions, my use of tiny talks. And I want to explain that a little bit. I'm going to talk about tiny talks through the tripartite. So I hope you're going to understand these three concepts through the concrete activity of tiny talks. And I want to then also introduce you to Elle, who is one of my teachers, and you can sort of read and see how she emotionally experienced her first time teaching, both in a bodily sense, but then also sort of psychologically through her language in dialogue with her partner. And, throughout this all, my take-home message is really straightforward. Vygotsky called teachers creators of life. That's a profound responsibility. I love that idea. And I think what we're trying to do is echo that as teacher educators, we must be creators of language teacher professional development. And so that's really the ethical responsibility that I'm talking about. Okay. So what is this tripartite framework? Well, it's innovation, intervention, and intentionality. It may be a little bit hard to read here, but we're going to focus on each of them individually in a minute. And what I want you to see is these three components are interactive. They work together. You don't just focus on one. You've really got to work them together to understand how it shapes, how it informs what you're going to do with your teachers, and then how you examine it. So we can move on to the next slide. So let me tell you a little bit about me and my emotional trauma that I experienced, where I was using reflection journals. At reflection journals, you everywhere you look, people will tell you what a great thing reflection journals are to have teachers critically reflect on what they just experienced in the classroom. And I used them for a number of years. I had very specific intentions for using those research journals. I wanted my teachers, if you look at the left side of the arrow, I wanted them to do it right after teaching. I wanted them to, reflect with themselves, so have a dialogue with themselves and think about it on a deeper level. I wanted them to write their reactions, their reasonings, their goals, and I wanted them to write honestly, so I would know how to guide them. Well, how the teachers took this up is that they did them far from their teaching. It would be like they taught, and then they would remember a week later, oh, I got to write a reflection journal. Well, writing a reflection journal a week after teaching, even 2 days after teaching, 2 days, let's say 2 days after teaching. It's not the same. And they ended up doing a kind of unidirectional writing rather than reflecting. What I mean by unidirectional, it's like they were writing an essay to me. These are the 3 things I did well in my teaching. And it was also written for what they thought I wanted rather than what they actually experienced. And there's been a lot of research that shows that that's the thing about reflection journals, that students write what teachers think. It's very performative. And so honestly, I had a lot of emotions. I mean, I had a little anger, which made me feel really frustrated. I had, a little disgust. I'm using these words because I looked up an emotional, one of these devices to sort of see what's the central emotion and what does it lead to. So disgust was one of the central emotions. But what I really felt was disappointed. I felt really disappointed. I felt fear in the sense of I was shirking my responsibility, but also that fear meant that I felt really disrespected by my students. And again, I don't think this was intentional on their part, So this created this emotional, cognitive emotional dissonance really created this contradiction. And I had to really think about what I could do to resolve this contradiction. So you can turn to the next slide. For me, I always go back to theory. And I talk to people too, don't get me wrong, but theory for me is what really shapes my practice. And as somebody who really tries to embody Vygotsky's ideas in my teaching, I go back to his works and I read them and I talk to other people. I read other people's papers and how they take up Vygotsky. And I just start asking myself a lot of questions, So how does this theory inform what I'm trying to do with my students? What are my goals when I try to engage them through practices? How do those practices shape my students' development? How does the theory help me to understand? And how does enacting that practice shape my understanding of theory? How does my understanding shape my practice? So again, it's this beautiful kind of interactive relationship between theory and practice. Your theory is going to, for me, inform my practice. I'm going to enact my practice. I'm going to try to understand what happened in that practice emotionally, but also through theory. And then when I reflect on it, I'm going to go back to theory as I try to make sense of what happened. And then if I think I want to enhance my practice, I'm going to look to theory to, again, try to help me to enhance my practice. So when I hear people say that teachers don't need theory, I feel this is really wrong. I think there's a lot of theory that is not helpful for teachers, don't get me wrong. But I think, if you, as a teacher, you have to have a theory of learning or a theory of development. You have to. It starts there. I don't care if you know everything about task-based learning. If you don't have a theory of learning, then task-based teaching means nothing. You can do communicative language teaching, but if you don't have a theory of learning, those are just activities. They're just things people do that aren't really growing out of how you see your students developing. So how do my students developing? That's always upmost on my mind. So I do this engagement with theory and practice, and we can move on to the next slide. And this is how I resolved that contradiction. So it's kind of we saw the earlier version of my emotional cognitive dissonance, and now you're seeing a visual representation of me overcoming that contradiction. And so I read a really, just a beautiful piece by Rebecca Zoshak about tiny talks. And it's a piece in language teaching research. She wrote it as practitioner research. She wrote it as a master's student. And it's just a beautiful piece that profoundly affected me, where she talked about tiny talks, which she describes as these fresh out of the classroom post-teaching discussions. Now for Rebecca, it was her first time teaching this course, and she was teaching by herself, but there was a person teaching in the same building, teaching the same course, and they would walk from that building back to the office together. No more than 8 minutes that walk would take. And in that 8 minutes, they would talk about what they experienced in the classroom. So I thought about what I wanted, and I saw right away that tiny talks, because my teachers co-teach, could be done immediately after teaching. It would be collaborative dialogue. It would be spoken conversation. It wouldn't be this kind of essay writing talk. And it would just naturally allow for this cognitive, emotional unloading. What Karen and I have called narrative as externalization, where you just dump what you just experienced. There's no thinking about it yet or reflecting. You're just, how did that go? And then you talk. So it really kind of, it seemed like a wonderful instructional practice to use in my setting, given what I know about my setting. And so I set out to then engage my teachers in tiny talks. Okay, next slide. So I'm using this as just a placeholder to say that I want to now go through tiny talks and the framework so you can see what this means. So it's just a placeholder slide. We can go on to the next one. So the first component of the framework is innovation. And the innovation are these context-specific changes to the social environment that embody a clear ideal towards which I'm trying to move my teachers, or it could be your students. So this notion of context-specific is extremely important. So the idea is, with the framework, you can apply it anywhere because there's psychological tools. Where does like your personal experience, your context come into play? This is where. So you have to create innovations, instructional practices that are context specific. My context is different from yours. You have to know your context, and so that's the beginning of that. But you also have to have a clear ideal. And by ideal, I mean, you have to have an idea. When my students do this activity, what's the main thing I'm trying to develop in them? Okay, so that ideal is, what am I trying to develop in them? How am I trying to move them as teachers towards that ideal? So for me, these tiny talks, you've heard me talk about how it emerged from my experience, right? Of feeling so frustrated and disappointed. And it to me, the way I understood it theoretically, it provided a safe mediational space through which I wanted to support my students to articulate their pedagogical reasoning and teacherly thinking. In other words, this is why I'm doing that. That's the ideal that I'm trying to cultivate through this. I want them to be able to talk about their teaching in more sophisticated ways. I want them to be able to talk about the reasoning behind what they're doing, how they experienced it, why they thought that happened, what might be an appropriate response, so that they can develop their teacherly thinking, because once they leave the internship, they're kind of on their own. And what I can cultivate is that teacherly thinking. I can't teach them everything there is to know about teaching, but I can cultivate that teacherly thinking. And it's in those tiny talks that they externalize all that they're experiencing emotionally, cognitively, again, through narrative as externalization. So that's that emotional unloading, but also through narrative as verbalization. And what I mean by that is, I have content that I teach. my teachers. And one of the things that we do are this notion of pedagogical concepts that have been growing out of Penn State is where, and these pedagogical concepts are, again, psychological tools that I try to engage my teachers with so they can understand their teaching differently. One of the pedagogical concepts is teach off your students, not at them. So you can imagine teaching at somebody, you're just lecturing, you're not thinking about how they're understanding it. You've got a goal, you've got things you want to say, you just say it. Teaching off your students is a totally different experience. Yeah, you have things you want to say, but you've got to respond to what your students' needs are, right? So that's one of the concepts. So I want my students to not just talk about their emotions in Tiny Talks. It isn't just like an emotional thing. They've got to think like teachers in Tiny Talks too. And that enables me to see the emotions, to identify these possible growth points. These growth points are these like challenges that students are facing that I want to actively support them in developing as teachers. So we're going to see that with L, the growth point that emerges. Now you'll see I've got a lot of citations in there made small. I don't want you to think I'm a narcissist, like talking all about myself here. I want you to see, like, I've really thought about this. I have been working on these ideas for years. And, you know, I was sharing this with my teachers the other day. I pulled out a PowerPoint that I used in 2015 to teach them about aspiration in English, you know, that P sound or T, that puff of air. And I wanted them to see where I was in 2015. And then they know where I am now, right? So I really, part of my goal too is I want beginning teachers to understand I didn't just hatch like this, you know? I've spent a lot of time reading, trying different things, analyzing it. And that's how I have developed as a teacher. It doesn't happen like naturally. It's a very intentional thing you work at. And it doesn't just happen through experience. I really think you need to talk to other people. You need to read theory. You need to read other people's ideas. You need all these things if you're going to develop as a teacher. And so when I have all those sites, I'm just trying to show you, like, these are ideas I've been thinking long and hard on for years that have kind of brought me here. And that's what I think, you know, a good teacher really tries to do is to spend that lifetime developing as a teacher, you know. So anyhow, I'll stop with that for right now. Can we move on to the next slide? So the other thing is this intentionality. I always tell my teachers, be thinking, what is Gollenbeck doing? Because everything I do is intentional. I have reasons for why I do most things in the class. And so these interventions have to involve an intention, and they have to be goal directed. You have to be trying to achieve something. Because when teacher educators have these, you know, theoretically grounded reasons for doing things, that's when you can create and enact a really meaningful intervention or, you know, activity, whatever you want to call it, with your students. Also, I want to be intentional because I want to engage in responsive mediation. Like, I want to know how to respond to my teachers as individuals because I have a clear idea of where we're going. So I don't know how to respond here, without like here, you know. I need where we're going in order to know how to respond. So I want to make my intentions explicit to my students. I want them to understand why they're doing what they're doing. Yes, it's theoretically based, but I'm not gonna talk theory talk with them. I got to find a way to make it understandable. So I want my teachers to understand why we're doing tiny talks, but I also, in addition to knowing that, they need to know the procedures, like how do you actually do this? And now I don't see my slides very well, so my screen just moved. So I want to describe the procedures. That's better, thank you. And I also want to give them the ground rules, like the conversational ground rules. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then I also want to give them examples of other teachers' tiny talks so they get it, you know, it's like, then you know what they're like. Otherwise, they're this mysterious abstract thing. So the thing is that even though I give an example, everybody takes them up differently. And that's kind of the beauty of it. Like, it's so much fun to see how individual pairs take these up. Sometimes there's a theme song that they develop. You know, it's just really interesting how they sort of take it up and make it their own. Okay, next slide. So what are some of the concepts that are shaping me? Well, the two on the top, I really want students to understand because it's really key for them to understand why they're doing it. Neil Mercer talked about thinking together. He did this wonderful book called Ways with Words, where he tried to get elementary school children to talk in exploratory talk in really, really deep ways, in a sense, to really get them to talk about something. And so he talks about having conversational ground rules that the teacher crafts, so that you're not just, like, for example, evaluating somebody. You know, that shouldn't be your point, to just evaluate somebody in a tiny talk. You want to foster discussion, deeper thinking. So how do I kind of take them through these ground rules? I love the idea of thinking together, but for me, it's thinking, feeling together. You know, you're going to see in the tiny talks how much these teachers feel together, and it's connected to their thinking about their teaching. Also, yeah, ZPD activities. So, you know, the ZPD is not a place. It's not something that you reach and then you're done. Lois Holtzman's work has really affected me. It's a collective form of working together. And it's in that working together that a ZPD emerges. And through that process, each person contributes something to it and takes something away. And it's quite different what they're contributing, as again, we're going to see in the tiny talks. And then finally, Maggie Kubenyova really, I think, has affected me a lot with her work based on the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. And he's a very interesting philosopher. Again, this is something very new to me recently within the last 2 years, where he talks about others and othering, and the importance of listening. And Maggie has called, taken Levinas's work and talked about the listening subject as a vulnerable, susceptible individual who does not predefine, label, or explain the other, but tries to remain open and respond to their call. And I think, you know, when you're working with teachers, you're kind of quick to make judgments. And I use this as my ideal. I try to embody this. I'm you know, sometimes I'm okay at it, and other times I'm really, really bad at it. But this really informs my thinking. I am trying to stay open to my students, not bug them with questions or evaluations. What I want to create a space for them to reveal themselves to me. I think that's such a beautiful idea. And honestly, I use it in my life. It isn't just my teaching. To have somebody reveal themselves to you is, oh my gosh, that's a profound, profound human interaction. And so Levinas's ideas really, really, I am so grateful to Dearden and Kubenyova for introducing that, because it's helped me to give a name to what I try to do, not always successfully. Okay, go ahead. So the third part is the intervention, and this is really the purpose of this pedagogical interaction that you're doing. And it is intended to intentionally provoke change. I underline this because in a lot of research, we go in and we say, oh, we're not trying to change people. We're just trying to capture what they have to say. And that's a kind of slippery slope, you know? As a teacher educator, no. As a researcher of teacher education, I'm just trying to find out what people are experiencing. If I'm doing that, I want to think about how to provoke change for their development. If they're experiencing negative emotions, I don't want to just chronicle those negative emotions. I want to be able to address them, and provoking the change is enabling them to begin to self-regulate, to not be, completely burned out. Like, what do we do? I also think, my teacher has to go into class Monday morning. They can't be emotionally overwrought. I have a responsibility to enable them to get into class Monday morning. So I think the purpose of research, this praxis-based pedagogy research, is to intentionally provoke change. And so through this, again, it's revealing this dissonance, and I can watch how they move with these socially mediated activities, the tiny talks and the other things that I do, to being self-regulated, while they then do their own teaching in ways that align with who they want to be as teachers. And then the other thing is, through this intervention, I want to see the impact of my mediation. I want to understand the quality and the character of my mediation, so that I know whether or not I'm meeting somebody's needs, how I can be doing better, how I could be doing something differently. Again, responsive mediation there's no perfection in this. We're human beings. We're trying to do the best we can with what we know, with what we have at any interaction. So I love that I have these audios and transcripts, which are pretty nice now, because of the one thing I'll say about ChatGPT is they will spit those things out. And I can listen or look at them, and it gives me a sense of how my teachers are developing over time. It makes it visible to me in a way. It's my data. That's my data as to whether or not teachers are developing. Okay, so let me take a little sip here. So that's the tripartite framework that is shaping my thinking about tiny talks, why I do it, why I'm doing it, what I want students to get from, how I'm then going to like self-examine through the data that I have to understand whether or not the impact of my pedagogy. And so let me talk a little bit more specifically about my context and a teacher I'd like to introduce you to. So I supervise what we call the internship. It also gets called the practicum throughout the world. And it is part of a 18-credit undergraduate TESOL certificate program at my university. And 18 credits is not a lot, right? You know, when I was becoming a teacher, I think I had a 2-year master's program. So, you know, I'm trying to pack in a lot in those 18 credits for sure. These are novice teachers. They are almost always first-time teachers. And they're from a variety of undergraduate majors. And they're typically in their senior year, not always. The teachers teach a 4.5-week workshop, and it's based on some cohesive theme that they have worked with me to create. And each student teaches this workshop twice. So they also teach on alternating weeks. So out of the first day, the half is the get to know you day. Out of the 4 weeks, each teacher teaches 2. And then they get to teach it again in another round of workshops following that. So it's a kind of do-over, which honestly, it's an amazing thing to be able to have a do-over. It's an amazing thing. Okay, we can move on. And that's one of the classrooms that they teach them. So these are my instructions for the Tiny Talks, where I try to make the ground rules explicit. And it's basically set up a Zoom link or audio tape yourself with your phones. It should be about 6 to 12 minutes long. I give that only because, you know, students, they always want to know how long does it have to be. Honestly, some people might finish some days in 5. Some people go 18 minutes, 20 minutes. It's like, it totally depends on what's happening. But having that framework is good. And then I say you'll share your file or link with me so I can listen and learn about what you're experiencing. I will then send you feedback with suggestions, providing materials, asking you further questions, and basically validating what you're feeling. I ask that it be sent by the following morning because I always set aside that morning to only listen to Tiny Talks and to respond. And I will tell you, one of the changes I made, I used to give written feedback. Now I give oral feedback. And it's really fun to do oral feedback back. And students seem to really like it. So it's super fun. I tell them your partner should start the conversation, and you can say something so simple as, how do you think that went? Or how do you feel about that class? Or what do you think went well today? Later, you might start saying something like, is there anything you wish you'd done differently? So I'm just giving them a little prompt because that prompt, it allows them to go, you know? I tell them that through this, they're doing the 3 Ds, dump, deepen, and do over. I want them to express what they're feeling. So dump their feelings, dump what they experienced, but then try to deepen it. Try to understand it through what we have talked about in class together about what was happening. Try to use the concepts that we've referred to. And then there might be a do-over, like, what would you have done differently? Or think about the next workshop. What are you going to do differently for that workshop? So then the teacher listener, I suggest that they ask questions. Again, this is not about evaluation. So you tell me something, well, why do you think that? What could you have done differently? Tell me more about that. Just tell me more. Let your partner know that you're with them. Oh, you seem so frustrated. Oh, yay, you seem happy. Or way to go, you know? So I encourage that kind of emotional validation, but also try to pull out a little bit more about why they're feeling that way, to really think about what they experience. So, okay, you can. So the 2 teachers we're going to be looking at are Phoebe and Elle, and they decided to teach a kind of pronunciation for communication workshop. And they focused on reductions, so things like have to, wanna, gonna, shoulda, woulda, coulda, those things that English speakers do that make English learners kind of wonder what you're saying, because you might not learn them in your home country. There was a week on syllable stress or vowel stress, syllables and vowel stress, because in English, primary stress drives a lot. Whether it's a butter or button or top, it's all about stress. So there's an introduction to stress, and then a week of linking. And then this flap T, which is so characteristic of American English. We say butter, not butter, or butter, like they might do in England. And deletions. So we delete a lot of stuff. I don't know if you do this in Portuguese. I know Spanish do this, but okay, I'm sure you do. Yeah. And that, you know, that kind of stuff is really hard for a learner of a language, because you learn the pure form. And then all of a sudden, you don't get that. So this was the focus of the class. And the two teachers were Phoebe and Elle. So Phoebe was an international studies major. She was a senior. She wanted to teach in France, and she did go and teach in France. She was really smart, super outgoing, very articulate, would kind of like instead of thinking things, she would talk through them in a way. And then her partner was Elle, who was a linguistics major, also a senior, wanted to teach in South Korea and did go. Also super smart, but very soft-spoken, not a big talker, would talk, but wouldn't volunteer, and also not super confident at all. So kind of, different personalities. And I should also say that they had class with me the semester before in this phonetics class that I teach for teachers. They sat next to each other, they knew each other, so they were very comfortable with each other after spending a lot of time together. And we can go to the next slide. And in that class, one of the assignments that I have them do when we start stress is I ask them to give a conceptualization, like a visual of stress, because it's really hard to understand what stress is. I can tell you something in linguistic terms, but I want them to try to represent it so that they show some understanding and that they can understand it to share with their students. And so this is the way that Elle represented stress, which is, the classic example of the noun versus the verb, record versus record, same word, but boy, do those vowels change, all because of stress. And I love how she talks about it, gives a word color, emphasis, meaning, focus. And so, again, this is sort of her starting point for stress that we're going to kind of see over the course of our visit with her. Okay, you can move on. And I just wanted to give you some sense of our email exchanges before she actually taught. So that first one, I'll send you some ideas later. I was just sending them materials to help them prepare for the workshop, right? And then Elle wrote to me, do you happen to have any time to go over my lesson plans? So again, we have that kind of mediation of lesson plans, okay? And then I say when, and I ask, because they had met the students, do you have a better sense of the students now? Do they know use the flap? And again, she responds, and she says, I'm beginning to think we might need to spend more time on syllables and stress than I originally planned. So at this point, she knows this is something students aren't feeling comfortable with. She's going to have to focus on. So again, I give a little idea, and then yeah, that purple I think is very interesting. She says, stress is hard even for native speakers to figure out. And, we're going to see that held very true for her. I mean, the other thing I want you to see is I use a lot of emojis in my emails, and I used to not do that, but I'm a very direct communicator. And so when I moved to the South, I found I was a little too direct for people, and I needed to soften. I was just being myself, and there was nothing mean in it, but people took it in a different way in the South. So now I throw emojis all over the place so people know that I'm really not angry. So you'll see a lot of emojis in my emails. Okay, you can go to the next one. So now this is the unfortunate part. In trying to get my very big PowerPoints over with audio, it didn't work. So you can't hear the audio. And you can see from this slide, I really wanted you to hear the audio because the first question was the tone, listen to the tone of Elle's voice. I'll try to dramatically recreate it for you so you can see what it sounded like. But from looking at the transcript, you can see the patterns of interaction, but take notice of that. I want to ask you, what role do you think Phoebe seems to play? What does Elle reveal about herself? And I don't mean just in what she says. Like there's more than just the obvious message. What is she revealing about herself? How does she express her emotions? And what's the growth point that seems to emerge? So if we can look at the transcript. So they start their tiny talks with a little jingle, tiny talk time. And so this was the beginning of it. And Phoebe asked, so how do you think that went? And Elle sounds something like this. I think, like that was my first time teaching. That's how I think it went. So right away, the tone of her voice, it's low. It's really low. That's how I think it went, oh. And then, I think like some of their questions or comments kind of threw me. Okay, right there, there is emotion there. When you get thrown, you are feeling a lot. And I got flustered. Big emotional cue there. And I was also very, very nervous. Not just nervous, not just very nervous, very, very nervous. I told Katerina at the beginning of this, I was shaking. This is a physical reaction to the kind of emotion she's feeling, that she's so nervous. But yeah, I think they had fun with it. So it's interesting. We often say something bad and then we try to even it out with something good. I think they had fun anyhow. But and then Phoebe comes back with, I think they had a great time. That's one thing about it. Yeah. And then Elle says, because they probably could tell that I was really nervous too. So it's not just that I felt nervous, but I think I am showing everybody how nervous I am. So you can imagine how nervous that is, where you're not only thinking about yourself, but how you're being, the image, the portrayal you're giving to other people. And then look at what Phoebe says. I think you taught off them really well, though. Wow. Pow. She's using one of the pedagogical concepts in her response to her. This is the first day of teaching. Wow, that is so impressive. Not just, oh, it's okay, it's okay. No, she uses a pedagogical concept to validate what she just did in the classroom. Really? Like with the responses and stuff, and like eliciting response and having them explain it. It like brought their confidence up, I think, which made them listen in more to what you were saying, if that makes sense. And she's just like, okay, because they were like, okay, I'm already familiar with this. Not like, what is this lady talking about kind of thing. I think you really did well to teach off of them, especially with them like kind of understanding, like Oslam. I guess he's already taken this course last semester. Did he? Well, obviously, he's like, oh, deletions. And I'm like, oh, my God. And the two of them laugh. He said, he said, like, he caught environmentally. Okay, so like that's where deletion's happening. We do not say environmentally, mentally. So, which, and then Elle says, which I didn't underline on purpose, because like that's next week's lesson, he shouldn't be looking at that. And then he said a lot of, like, that's next week too. Yeah, I was like, great. But I did not expect anyone to catch a lot of. But also there was sometimes I was just flustered, especially when it comes to stress, because stress is still kind of hard for me to explain. And it was something I was really nervous to explain, and like that they would get hung up on. Like, I think I spent a little more time on stress than I was prepared to, but not prepared enough. Because I was watching the clock and I think we did all right, but Yeah, like when I was going to record, I kind of switched myself up. So she's getting herself confused in her own, like we saw it was part of her concept. She's getting confused in her own presentation of that. And then Phoebe said, yeah, that's why I wrote that back on the board about the vowel length. Like she helped her out. She did a little mediation in the class while she was teaching to help her so you could rearrange it in her head. So, you know, when you hear L, you can see that she's very nervous about not only interacting with students, but she's not feeling confident about her understanding of stress. And so for me, you know, it's obvious that I need to focus on this growth point of her understanding of stress, but tied to that is building her confidence. Like she's got to feel more confident and comfortable, more competent and confident. Those are the two words I frequently use. She's got to feel more competent and more confident, and they kind of feed off of each other, you know? So she's physically feeling these emotions, and yet, you know, she's kind of dumping, but Phoebe is so impressive in this, and it's like Phoebe reveals a lot about herself too. It isn't just Elle, but I can see how Phoebe understands these pedagogical concepts that I've been talking about in class. She can observe Elle and see what's happening and name it and kind of talk through it and what the students were doing that were exemplifying it. And so, you know, she's really kind of just a wonderful partner to have in this case. So that was the first day. You can, next. So this is at the point I was emailing and not responding orally, which is okay because we don't have the oral responses anyhow. And my comment was, your first day of teaching's in the books, exclamation, exclamation. I can hear how flustered you felt at times, especially their questions seemed to unsettle you, but Phoebe had lots of positive things to say. First of all, Phoebe thought you taught off the students well, that you took their understanding and questioned them and built off what you got. This seemed to be a confidence builder. You both agreed that students had fun and they got the ideas. You felt flustered by explaining stress, but nonetheless, they seemed to get it. And then let's meet, because an email isn't gonna be enough here. I know that. So right away, you know, do you have any time Monday? Sure, let's meet. Okay. So again, you know, tiny talks aren't everything, and there's other things that have to happen, like face-to-face meetings, going over lesson plans. We watch videos and we talk about, you know, the videos of the teachers themselves. But, you know, some students need to meet more often than others, and that's part of responsive mediation. So we met. I helped her prepare her next class, and I'm not going to go through the tiny talk, but look at my response to the next class on the next slide. Look at that, one day, her second day of teaching. You both felt this went better than last class. Phoebe thought you did a good job explaining, though she initially thought you should ask them. So, you know, again, as a beginning teacher, often the response is to explain rather than ask the students to explain. Let the students give the answer, but no, beginning teachers want to explain everything, you know. She noted that the answer needed your expertise. Yes, I wrote that, your expertise. Armin was the only new student, so you had no need to explain, and he had a tutor last year, blah, 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 okay? Phoebe thought it might be good to highlight and italicize key sounds. That sounds like a fabulous idea, okay? So her partner's giving her this great idea, and I am validating it. What a good teaching buddy. Phoebe thought she would use other resources because she noticed that they didn't have any trouble understanding you, but did your friend. So in other words, Elle played a video of her and her friend talking, and she wanted them to listen and do some activity to identify the stress. They could understand Elle, but they couldn't understand the friend. Not surprising. They're used to Elle. Also, Elle probably spoke differently. This friend probably spoke, you know, blah, 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 you know, like you would in normal speech. And so, interesting, huh? Tongue twister, Phoebe thought maybe doing it as a warm-up could be good. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I get it. That makes sense. Phoebe thought having the transcript with all the answers from the previous week would be helpful. I get that. It's all about making things clear for students, right? Your volume and speed were good. And yeah, so actually I realized this isn't the second day, it's her second week of teaching. But what I want you to see is she's taught 2 classes. This is her 3rd class, actually. Her 3rd class. Already we're seeing movement in her ability to be confident in what she's presenting and to develop her confidence. And again, we see Phoebe being a really wonderful partner. So that tells me a lot about Phoebe as it does Elle. Next slide. So then we get to the second workshop, and Elle is teaching stress again. It's that first day where she felt flustered and was shaking. And Phoebe was running late that day. So class had started. She wasn't sure if she should interrupt because she said, "You look so confident from the window." I looked from the window before I came in. And Elle says, "Thank you. That was good. When you told me you weren't feeling confident in the beginning, it really surprised me." And Elle says, "Yeah, before I started class. I wasn't feeling confident before I started class." Okay. When I started class, I lost my nerves, which is awesome. And Phoebe says, "I love that." So, now we see, yeah, Elle is still nervous, but as soon as she hits the classroom, that thing takes over her where she's being the teacher, and those nerves kind of go by the wayside now that she is developing her confidence and her competence. So again, we've done some things to help her get to this point. Okay. Yeah, we'll move on to the next one because we can't listen. But I want you to see that this is a very different Elle. She's not talking about her emotions here. She's talking about her teaching. "Oh, that's kind of a bad example. Yeah. And then she was like, and then she explains to us, "Well, I don't know. I was like, there could be secondary stress before, but I don't think there's any examples of that. I don't have anyone to trick you up. I think I said something like that." But so food for thought. So again, she's talking about her teaching differently. And then she says, "Oh yeah, the record. I heard your voice in my head, Katerina, and it went way smoother. And then I was studying and forgot my words the first time. This time, it was so much smoother." And then you can see how she's discussing the students, not herself. The first time, she was focused on herself. Now she's talking about the students were being proactive in groups. They were hashing it out. They were saying this. She can focus on the students now. And, she talks about what she actually did with the students. So then she says, whenever they had a question, I asked them, "Well, which vowel is longer?" And they pretty much got it. So she is understanding how to work with stress now, which is really amazing. So I'm noticing the time. I want to try to wrap up, I think. But next slide. And next slide, because we can't hear this. So what I want to emphasize is that Tiny Talks allowed me to create these conditions, to mediate these students, these teachers responsively, that it reveals their cognitive emotional needs, and I can provide the support they need. Their abilities are revealed through this co-constructing. Not only did I learn about Elle when Elle taught, but I learned a lot about Phoebe when Elle taught, and vice versa. And how their development happens is revealed in this talks because you see the changes synchronically and diachronically. So over time, the way they talk changes. And that last one really showed something, like Elle talking in very authoritative, confident terms. Okay, next slide, I think is, allowed me to act as a susceptible listener. I don't want to focus on this too much because I think I'm running out of time, but it just allowed me, what?
It's okay, Paula, just it's fine.
Okay, all right. The thing about tiny talks and listening, I am so focused only on them. I'm not interacting with them. So I'm like in a space where I can only focus on them. And that's like a real gift to be able to do that. I could really focus on what they were experiencing, how they took up the concepts, what they could notice about their own teaching or what they could notice about their partner's teaching. How they discussed content, but also how they work together to achieve subjectivity. So just to sort of compare, when Phoebe did her tiny talks, she would just talk for 2 minutes straight, really different from Elle. So you can sort of see the differences in your teachers from how they talk. And it really gives you some window in how to engage with them as individuals. And I think there's another slide. So I'm committed to praxis-based pedagogical interventions, but also research, because it enables me to gauge how my intentionality and ideals are realized, whether they're not. It allows me to examine the experience, the practice for myself and the teachers through theory to enhance how I interact with teachers. And it helps me to develop my expertise as a language teacher educator quite regularly and identify where I need development. And so then I have a bit of references on the next slide. And then my final slide. So I hope that you got something out of this. And again, emotions are so important. I hope you walk away understanding I really believe in emotions, but I really think we need to be careful when we are researching emotions, that we're not just contributing to an overload. And also, we do have an ethical responsibility to help teachers know how to deal with the emotions if they're going to develop. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Paula. I think we can stop sharing the screen right now. And this has been so inspiring and so wonderful. Thank you so much. I have lots of questions, but of course I cannot ask all my questions. But what I think it's so important, first of all, I think I wrote in that we have a group there, but I said that you really walk your talk, you don't really, talk about emotions and jump on the bandwagon. Actually, I didn't say this when I introduced Paula, but Paula is one of the pioneers in talking about teacher emotions. In 2014, she had this wonderful paper already talking about these ideas. And as she said, she's been working and studying this a lot, and not only for research, but to apply, to do it in her own life and herself. So she's there with students in the, how do you say this in English? In the battlefield, let's put it that way. You were there. You're not just researching emotions about teachers, right? You were there in the messiness of everything. So that's what I think is the beauty of it. And you don't look at emotions as isolated, but you were talking about cognitive emotional development. So maybe some people look at these tiny talks, the transcripts, and they may think, well, where are the emotions? Because in a way, and I include myself in that, we have a lot of research on emotions that we are, like you said, only describing the emotions. But like you said, what are we going to do with this? And how are we helping teachers to develop with our work? So I think these are really, really important questions for us to take with us here today. And also the idea of provoking change. And I think this is so important as well, because like you said, we are afraid of saying that we are going to change because we are afraid. I don't know why we are afraid, but we are afraid. Oh, you need to put your mic on, please. Go ahead.
It's research. It's supposed to be objective.
That's true. Yeah, we cannot interfere, right? Yes, just leave the teachers there, you know. Yeah, that's true. So I think that's a really great idea. Do you want to say something, Suellen, about that?
I have a curiosity, a comment and a curiosity, a question to Professor Paula. She suggests tiny talks, right, as an alternative to traditional reflective journals. I remember that we read on her article. And since these don't always capture, right, learners' experiences and emotions in authentic ways, but in our group, we noticed that even without using the term tiny talks, we already practice similar activities, right, Anna? Like attentive listening, journals based on conversations, and other kinds of reflective dialogues. But it's really hard because there are around 20 students per class. We advise 20 students. So my curiosity is how many students do you usually advise when you are in this kind of group and emotional research and practicum, right? During their practicum. If she could hear me.
The most I will have is 18. So you can imagine then that's 9 groups. This is what I would say. You don't have to listen to every single one. So you might decide on certain days that you're going to listen, and you can't listen to every single one, but weekly you do listen. And so I think, my suggestion would be with 18 and 9, I do listen twice a week. They teach twice a week. I listen twice a week. And obviously this is my thing. So I'm really that's what I do. But I understand you have more students, or they're teaching more days, that maybe you don't listen to everyone, and you kind of figure out a pattern that works for you. This is about understanding your context and what's going to work for you. And so I think that's super important.
Sorry, I really liked when you mentioned that it's also a collaborative work, right? Because you invite students to dialogue, to intervene, right? To ask questions about the experience, the other students' experiences. So this is also something that is not only on you, right? They also did you hear me? I think your image for me was frozen. Okay. They also ask questions. So they also invite the colleague to reflect on their experiences, right? So it's not on you only.
I mean, it's so much about not just the tiny talks and teaching. It's like, how are you a good communicator? I mean, there's lessons beyond teaching for this activity in terms of, you could use this with your spouse, with your friend, with anybody, this idea of tell me more about that, and not like sort of withholding judgment and trying to help them either express themselves or again, name what they're experiencing, that kind of thing. That's super helpful in a lot of things in life, The other thing I wanted to say is, sometimes people don't have somebody to talk to. And I also have done some work with tiny self-talks and I did this myself last semester. I was teaching something new, and I would come out of the classroom and pull out my phone and talk to myself. And again, it's different than if I sat down and wrote a reflection, it's different when you're talking. So I think that's the other thing. In some cases, you can't have people talk together. And I think self-talks can be a great thing. I remember somebody telling me once that they were traveling long distances from one place to another. They would sit in their car and kind of do tiny talks driving to the next place. So like, again, I think it's about making it work for your context. But something else, Suellen?
There is a question here. Anna, I'm starting to bring the audience questions, okay? Is that
Yeah, I was going to do that, but go ahead.
Okay, great. Because there is a question here that I was also curious about, and I don't remember if I read this in the article. Which tool do you use so they can record these tiny talks, their audios, their reflections, and which is the tool that you use to share those reflections? I mean, with you and among the students. I think it was Alexandre Badin that asked that question.
I just use voice recorder on my phone, and I'll pull out my phone. I've got a voice recorder app. It's called Voice Recorder, and then I'll save it and I'll send it to my students either via email. So I'll send it to myself and then them, or if I have their numbers, I'll send it to them. People have different kinds of phones, so if they have Apple, I don't know. I don't know Apple, so I don't know what they use. But also, like, sometimes people would use whatever's available on the computer in the room. So some people use Zoom and they would send me that, or they just use some sort of link that's on the computer there. So honestly, whatever, I just sort of use whatever is available on my phone. Yeah.
I think the question was related to which tool you send through email, right? So here in Brazil, for example, we use WhatsApp, for example, to share these audios and to talk, right, while we are doing our reflections, so we can interact faster. So in your situation, you usually send through email, and then they listen to it and then respond to you when it's. Mm-hmm. Okay.
But WhatsApp is totally appropriate. WhatsApp would be great.
So we have other questions here, and I'm gonna ask two of them. I don't have the names here. Maybe one person asked, how have your student teachers felt the Tiny Talks experience so far? Do they somehow prefer that instead of writing the journals? What initial perceptions or reactions did you observe from this practice in the classroom? Maria Clara do Sul.
Honestly, they love it. They will tell me that it's one of the favorite things that they do all semester. It really, at first they're a little uncertain if they're doing it right, and then they realize there's not a right. And as soon as they get my response and they see what my response is, how it targets what they're talking about, then they're like, I get it now. And honestly, I have had just an incredibly positive experience with this, with teachers, and they like the emotional support. It's a lot about just being able to talk it through with somebody, because the first time you teach, you're like, oh my God, that was so bad. And then somebody else says, no, it wasn't bad. And this is what I saw. So it's another set of eyes that I think it takes. The way we criticize ourselves, it's a different set of eyes that offers a different view of ourselves that we don't grace ourselves with. And I think they really appreciate that. Now, have I had a bad experience with Tiny Talks? Yes, I have. I have had a bad experience. And that bad experience was about a person who thought it was her role to critique her co-teacher rather than engage in dialogue. And so it setting up the ground rules and giving them, like, it's not about critiquing, it's about, tell me about that, tell me more. Like, giving them some language is super important. But that was not a good experience. So I have had that one bad experience.
Yes, it happened to me once as well, not in a Tiny Talk, but when I was teaching language teaching methodology, they would do their mini presentations in class, and then I would get them in groups to discuss the presentation. And I gave the rules and everything, you need to be supportive, etc. And then this student, just had very harsh criticism towards the colleagues. So it was very awkward, very embarrassing, very sad to see that. So, it does happen. Yes, there is another question here by Livia. Thank you, Professor Paula, for this amazing presentation. I have a curiosity. How long have you been practicing these tiny talks? Is there any clue to continue open and not influenced by experience? I didn't understand the last part.
I have been doing them now for 10 years. And there was a piece that I wrote, I think in 2015, I think that sort of got me reflecting on it. Maybe 9 years, okay. But it's been about sort of 10 years in the works. And again, I used to just write emails back, and then I was like, why are they talking to me and I'm mailing back? And I was like, do you want to hear me? Because my immediate reaction was, they don't want to hear me. They'd rather just read a quick email. And they were like, no, we want to hear you. So like, that was a big change in what I'm doing. But yeah, almost 10 years.
Great. Okay, so there are other questions here. In the beginning, I think Alexandre Badin, he said, as a teacher educator, I need to respond to my teachers' doubts, anxiety, and I feel I miss vital points along the way. How to cope with that? But I think he answered his own question. Please correct me, Alexandre. To be open to my teachers, not evaluate or judge them. So I think he answered. He gave the answer, right? Am I still on? Right?
I mean, the other thing is, when you like, for me, choosing to focus on developing her understanding of stress and building her confidence, in some ways it's not connected to maybe another issue she has, but in other ways it could be. Like, the thing is, you make choices as a teacher educator. You can't overload your students. You identify what you see as the most pressing thing that is inhibiting somebody in their work, and that's what you focus on. And there's not, I don't want him to think as though he's missing things, because by virtue of being human, we're making choices, and we're choosing something over something else, but we're focusing on what we are understanding as the most important thing. And again, you can, when you talk to them, you can see whether that's true or not. So yeah, I think staying open is the answer, as you said.
Okay, let me see another question here. Okay, yeah, so the AI tool, Suellen had already asked. Inez Miller said, hi, Ana Maria and Paula, what a great pleasure to be able to attend your talk. Then somebody asked, how many students do you usually advise?
So
she has already answered, right?
Yeah, it's typically about 15 to 18.
Oh, okay. I don't know if there is another question from the audience, but there were, let me see here.
I don't know if you asked Maria Clara's question.
Yeah, I did. I did.
Somebody
said, Areta Bello, this is amazing, this feedback. Paula, I need you in my life.
Reach out to me, and I'm happy to be in your life and provide you with some feedback if you want. I'm always able to do that.
Yeah, great. And I think there is another one here, Marta Nobri from the LET group. I'm the LET group. LET is from a group coordinated by Gisele. She couldn't be here today because she's on a PhD defense dissertation. But her group is here, and we studied your article, and so we are grateful to be here. My question: how do you think the principles behind Tiny Talk could be adapted to professional contexts for experienced teachers who often work in isolation? Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's this whole notion of like the water cooler talk, or the teacher room talk. I think, oh my gosh, Keith Richards talked about that years ago, right, Anna? The teacher room talk. I mean, even though we teach in isolation, we still connect with other teachers throughout the day. And honestly, if you could just get 5 minutes of somebody's time, I bet that would be a great start. 5 minutes is not too much. Find a way to make it work. You got to walk somewhere. You've got to eat lunch or something, you know? So I understand that. I also, sometimes I don't talk to teachers. I just talk to my friends, which I feel is a variation of a tiny talk. I have told my friend who's an accountant and another friend who's a lawyer about tiny talks, and like we kind of laugh that we do tiny talks in our lives, you know? So like it could also be that you don't necessarily talk to somebody at work. You know, it could be an unknowing communicator, because really all you want to do is externalize. And yes, the other person clearly, like Phoebe, offered a lot, but I think for an experienced teacher, sometimes it's just externalizing it, and it becomes a concrete thing that you can, like, it becomes real. And then you're like, oh, that's my problem. That's my issue. That's my challenge. That's what I'm facing. So you can begin, even, I think, and this is what I did with my tiny self talks, is to sort of identify what my growth point was and try to work at it. So I don't want teachers to be isolated, but if you are, I think tiny self talks can work, but just find somebody. 5 minutes.
Yeah, we did talk about it when we discussed your article, and I think a lot of us there, we said, oh, I talked to my husband, wife, partner, you know, and I talked to other people. But then I think we also discussed, I mean, it's fine, it's great to talk to these people, but we also kind of wondered if these people will be able to give us the feedback that we need, because it's one thing to talk to your husband and or wife or partner, and then another thing to talk to somebody who is also a teacher, who can understand the kinds of things we go through.
They can't give you the feedback that you need, but I guess what I'm saying is, I think with experienced teachers, when we externalize something, we see things differently, and we might actually be able to see what we need without somebody pointing us exactly to that spot. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Okay. There is another question here, also by Areta Bello. She said, as an auto-ethnographer, I myself would be analyzing my data. Do you think that my only option would be to rely on theory to look at what I'm feeling and how I deal with it? Thank you.
No, of course not. I mean, no, of course not. And I know that autoethnography and doer ethnography are extremely prevalent now as methodologies or even epistemologies. But I guess what I'm saying is, I think with teachers, you can't only prioritize experience. Experience will only take you so far. You need other things besides just the experience. I can have the experience and understand what just happened, but not know what to do in response. So where do I go? Maybe it's theory, but also maybe it's, and when I say theory, I'm using that term broadly. It might be like, I need to see what other people say about how to teach something. You know, that isn't theory, but other people have ideas about how to engage in activity. So I want to engage with other knowledgeable sources. Let me say that theory is one, but other knowledgeable sources, I think, are necessary sometimes. Sometimes experience is not enough. And that may not be a popular thing to say to an autoethnographer, I'm not sure. But I think we need more than experience, though I think experience is what is super essential. And if I'm a beginning teacher, I don't have the experience to draw upon really to know what to do in the classroom. As a more experienced teacher, I have more experiences to draw on, but I think sometimes we need more knowledgeable sources, whatever that might be, or whoever that might be, and that's what I would say, is needed.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. There are other comments here. Alexandre said, being with fellow teachers and chatting about our classes can help a lot. Deopilate, I guess, and I feel lighter somehow. We talked about having professional support network or something of the sort. Alexandre, he's a university professor. He has a great group of colleagues, and they chat. They have the same room after classes, so they talk all the time about their classes and about their experiences and theory. And then Marcos Daniel said, as a novice teacher, expressing
Can I
my
say
feelings.
something though? Like, I wonder what they do with that talk, though. Like, you can have the talk, but maybe there should be a little bit more there to try to benefit from that talk a little bit more. I don't know. I'm just going to say that. Go ahead.
So that's what I meant when I said, when we talk to our partners, it's good, but, sometimes we miss this a little more. Thank you. Marcos said, as a novice teacher, expressing my feelings has been very important as it helps me better understand myself, connect more with my students, and foster a positive and empathetic learning environment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's just a comment.
I second that. Yes, I love that.
Yeah. Okay, so I have lots of questions here. We don't have more questions from the audience, but if I may ask two questions. One is, do you think we could do these tiny talks, teachers with students, like students doing the tiny talks?
So I'm teaching English, and I want the students to do it?
Yeah, language students. I don't know.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna say I think theoretically it's possible. I think you would have to really structure it in a way that they knew why they were doing it and how they would do it. So again, I'll go back to, why would you want to do that? Let me ask you, why would you want to do that?
Well, as a way of but helping them to reflect about their learning process. So it would be them reflecting about, how they acted in the classroom or in certain activity, how they felt about certain activities, this kind of stuff. Like, language learning autonomy and learning how to learn. That would be the idea.
Okay, so again, I think I would want to tease out that idea a little bit more. I want them to be able to self-reflect and articulate,
articulate about their language learning experiences or trajectories and how these trajectories help them be the learners that they are now, and with their emotions and cognitions, beliefs and emotions, if they can reflect on that.
And then I'd really want to think about, what do I want those conversations to look like? So how do I give them the conversational ground rules to get them started to talk that way? Right. And then I think what I would do is I would try it small scale, and then think, okay, what do I need to do to tweak this to make them talk more about X? And so I would consider this a project, but I would sort of be explicit about, I would go through those three components of the tripartite, and I would be able to articulate that, and then I would have to come up with something specifically for them to do, because students want to know what to do, And it would have to be, I think, some quite specific prompts to get them talking the way you did.
Yeah.
And I think you would learn how to do it through doing it. So, okay, this would be an example. Okay, you don't do it once and it's great. You're probably going to need to do it a few times before you figure out what the best way to do this is, or your students will give you insights into that. That, you know, their experience, this is where their experiencing of it will be giving you insights into what you should be doing. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Paula. I think I understand. And yeah, I was just thinking, you know, how we could apply this wonderful idea to, you know, language teaching. So
But
I think
it's something you just do. I think it's something you got to really think long and hard about if that's really what you want to do. And is it, is it worth it? You know, is it worth it?
I know. Thank you. Thank you. I think we might have to close here because Jiva is having a problem there with his notebook, and Suellen said that there is a storm coming out in her place in Bahia. So we probably need to close, unfortunately, because we could be here talking for many, many hours. Paula, thank you so much. This has been so inspiring. And if we need to talk more with you, maybe we can invite you again and just have this chat with our group. We would love that. Thank you so much.
I would love that too. And I really sincerely mean that to the audience, that if there's something, you know, reach out to me if you feel like you have some dialogue you want to have with me, and I'm, you know, always open to that too. So
great. Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
So again, Professor Paula, please come back.
My pleasure to meet you.
So on behalf of GPLA, LET, and FORPROLI team, I would like to thank you again, Professor Paula. Thank everyone who are still here on with us on the channel. Please do not forget to follow us on our social medias, also social networks, FORPROLI.UFSB, and LET, Linguagem, Ensino e Trabalho. To sum up, right, this video here on the channel and share it with anyone, right, who may be interested with the topic, and we hope to see you again here in the same place, right, at FORPROLI channel, the same time at 4 p.m. Brasilia time zone on October 23rd, okay, to talk about emotional well-being in language teacher education. The role of inner peace. Okay, it's gonna be with Matilde Oliveira. She's an assistant professor of TESOL at the National University of Rio Cuarto in Argentina. Okay, guys, so thank you again. Thank you very much, Professor Paula, Professor Ana, Jiva, Felipe. We bring today's meeting to a close, and a big hug, and see you soon. Thank you.
Okay. Ciao.
Bye.